Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Nice to see you all again. I've just eaten some soup. So, green Thai soup. Wasn't very nice, to be honest. It looked nice. It looked spicy, but then it wasn't at all. It was just green. It looked like someone had sneezed into a big bowl. So yeah. Speaking of sneezing, I do still have a cold. Just call me Snotbags Smith. But you know, it's getting better, as colds always do. We're still reading The Fury. There's no chapter numbers. I'm not going to try and guess. We are, probably about a quarter of the way through, I'd say, maybe a little bit less. And Cal has literally just been attacked by everyone he was playing football with. And I mean, they were literally trying to tear him to pieces. Yeah, it's sunny again today, so I'm glowing again. So Cal has nearly died. He managed to break into a car or steal a car and escape from these hordes of people that were trying to tear him to pieces. Brick was attacked by his girlfriend and then by everyone in the local gas station, or garage as we call them over here. When he went to try to call his dad, everyone tried to attack him. So there is a common theme appearing here that someone's ringing me. I'm sure it's not important. It's just my wife. She's not important. I'm just kidding. Love you, Becky, if you ever watch these. I'd better just text her and say I'm recording. I don't know why she's ringing me. She's literally upstairs. I mean, how lazy can you be? Okay, so yeah, and Daisy, our other character, is kind of just noticed that people are starting to be a bit weird to her and a bit unkind, and her mum and dad especially are behaving very out of sorts. So anyway, we're back with Brick for this chapter. Brick, Fursville, 12:17 p.m. He's kind of just got back from being attacked at the garage. Garage. The torch lay just inside the door. Oh, we know he's just gone down the basement steps to try and find out if he can get to his laptop without Lisa attacking him. The torch lay just inside the door on its side. Brick turned it on and it spat out a weak light, hardly enough to illuminate the gloom. The first thing he saw was his computer, lying face down on the floor, its screen throwing out a ghostly aura. He scanned the room, waiting for a shape to come flying at him, for teeth to lock into his face, his throat. But it was strangely still in here, like he'd stepped into a painting, the quiet broken only, I nearly spilt my water again, by the soft whir of his laptop and the thrashing beat of his pulse. Then a portion of the darkness moved, smoke against shadow near the far wall. From here it looked like a burlap sack, a lump of cloth bundled into itself. A groan escaped it, followed by a soft sob and a clump of unintelligible words. "Don't just stand there, get the laptop," his brain commanded, but the sight of Lisa there, so hurt, so damaged, was too much. He wanted to go to her, to help her, to carry her out of this place and take her to hospital. He wanted her to be like she had been before last night. Annoying and selfish and bossy, yes, but also funny and kind and sexy as hell when she chose to be. It wasn't too late. The lump shifted again, a long limb flopping out and hitting the floor with a sound like a foot stepping in a puddle. Another followed, making Brick think of a spider caught in running water, unfolding itself before scuttling off. But this thing, it's not a thing, it's Lisa, wasn't going anywhere. She giggled, the laugh like cut glass, becoming another low, choked groan. "Lisa?" he asked. He couldn't stop himself. She raised her head, her eyes pockets of darkness in the flesh of her face. A bruise fanned out from her nose, and her mouth was a ragged hole that opened and closed in a bandana of blood. Lisa observed him, tilting her head first one way, then the other. She attempted to crawl towards him, but her left wrist was bent back at an impossible angle. The tips of her fingers almost lodged in the crook of her elbow. It couldn't hold her weight, and she crashed down. The basement went dark, and for a second Brick thought he was going to faint. Lisa had done this, trying to hurt him. She had broken herself. Even now she was trying to get to him, using her legs to shunt herself forwards, her face sliding wetly. It was this that spurred Brick on. The longer he stayed here, the more damage she'd do to herself. He walked towards the table, never taking his eyes off her for more than a moment. He picked up the laptop, folding it closed, feeling for the dongle and finding it in the USB port. Lisa had raised her head again, studying him. The change of angle meant that he could see her eyes. One of them was completely red, swimming in blood. In spite of her injuries, they burned. She looked possessed. Brick walked to the corner, to the pile of bags that sat there. They had been emptied over the floor, a bottle of water half drunk and lying on its side, and 3 or 4 packets of sweets. Still keeping his eyes on Lisa, and one hand on the wall, he edged around the room, crouching down and loading the sweets back into a carrier bag. There were 5 bottles of water left in the multi-bag, and he snatched them too, then changed his mind and pulled 3 of the bottles from the cardboard and left them. He could always drink from the taps in the kitchen, and he didn't know how long Lisa would be down here. He put everything, even the laptop, into the bag, holding it in one clenched fist as he retreated towards the door. Lisa watched him move for as long as she could hold her head up, then it dropped once more. She uttered another moan, full of frustration, full of confusion, and it almost snapped Brick's heart clean in two. He waited until the open door was at his back before speaking. "I'm sorry, Lisa. I don't know what to do. There's water and I left you some sweets." The sound of his voice was making her lurch, a hand sliding towards him. He noticed that one of her fingernails was hanging loose. He took a step back, stumbling over the junk in the corridor, hitting the wall hard enough to have his breath snatched away. He clutched the carrier bag to his chest. "I'll find a way to help you," he said. "I promise. You'll be okay. I promise." She made one last effort to look at him, her eyes inkwell black. There was nothing in that face. It was a half-melted mask that seemed to be sliding loose. Her mouth fell open, something bubbling from it. But Brick reached out and slammed the door shut before he could hear what it was, shouting one last time, "I'm sorry!" He secured the metal pole between the door and the wall again. Not that he thought Lisa would be going anywhere. Then he walked up the stairs and turned left, heading down the corridor away from the fire door. He reached a double door on which a peeling sticker read, "To all pavilion staff, remember to smile." And for some reason he obeyed that advice as he pushed his way through, his mouth peeling open into a corpse-like grin. Yeah, no doubt about it. He was going nuts. He was in the front foyer of the pavilion, the box office a small window in the wall to his right, and past that the main doors, sealed tight with more chains. On the other side of the room were the toilets, the stairs to the floor above the gift shop, and next to them, past a diorama of plastic jungle plants and a life-sized stuffed leopard toy which looked as though it had come from one of the game stalls outside, were the doors to the theatre. A banner reading "Jurassic Farce" drooped from the wall like a creeper. Brick collapsed against the wall amongst the plants, next to the glass-eyed leopard, taking one of the water bottles from his bag and quenching a thirst that had raged unnoticed until now. He pulled out his laptop, expecting to see the screen cracked and useless. When the machine warmed up, however, he saw that it was just as he had left it, apart from a dark, inky blotch at the top right corner of the screen. The battery sat at a little under half full, which was worrying because out here there was no power. A little box told him that he had been logged out because of inactivity, and he quickly typed his password back in, clicking the connect button. The little blue light on the dongle flashed furiously as the screen reported, "Waiting for network, connecting, authenticating, you are online." Then the box disappeared, leaving the browser window. He typed BBC News into the Google bar, the page loading up faster than it would have done downstairs, but still painfully slow. "Come on," he said. "Come on, come on, come on." He bent forward, his face practically up against the screen. What was he expecting? A headline reading "Zombie outbreak across the country as people turn on each other," followed by advice on how to cope? "Stay inside, do not go out because random strangers will try to kill you. Be especially careful not to make out with your girlfriend as she may try to bite your face off." Or maybe there wouldn't be anything at all. Maybe the BBC News site would be down. Maybe the whole internet would be down. The logo flashed up, the page loading below it. Brick scanned the text as it appeared. North Korea nuclear tests condemned, royal divorce to go ahead, and a whole raft of things about the Olympics. Not a single mention of savage mob attacks or unprovoked violence. Brick frowned. Maybe it was a local thing. He typed Eastern Daily Press into Google and was directed to a front page full of reports about broken council pledges and a bit about some guy who collected pillar boxes. He found the date and time of the latest article. It had been posted 8 minutes ago. The events at the garage had been, 3 hours before? Surely a riot in a quiet Norfolk town was more newsworthy than the fact that some sado had a rare South African mailbox. This didn't make any sense. Brick rested his head against the wall, chewing on his thoughts. When an old lady was so much as knocked over in the street, the EDP gave it a 6-page feature. How the hell could it have missed this? The garage must have been swarming with cops and paramedics all morning, juicy photos of bloody tarmac and shattered windscreens just begging to be taken. He typed garage Hemingway into Google, finding nothing but an address for the petrol station and a load of stuff about the writer, even though the names were spelled differently. Something hit the main doors hard enough to make the chain rattle. A white shape bounced up past the filthy glass, squawking, another one joining it. 2 seagulls. There was a flash of yellow as the birds fought. One flew off, the other in pursuit. Brick tried to swallow his heart back down into his chest, waiting for his hands to stop shaking before hitting the keys again. Why does everyone hate me? He typed, scanning the list of results on the Google page. They were all from Q&A and self-help sites. He clicked the top one, Yahoo Answers, reading a few lines about some kid who didn't have any friends. I'm sorry to hear that, Brick said as he clicked the back button, but I think my problem is worse than yours. He deleted the last request, entering, "Why is everyone trying to kill me?" A couple of entries down, he saw it. Everyone is trying to kill me. He clicked, only to see a video game site loading up. Everyone in Thieves Landing is trying to kill me. What did I do? Oh, damn it, he said, going back to the search page, scanning about 100 entries before realising it was pointless. He was frowning, and it hurt his face. The bite wound in his eyebrow was pounding. He should probably have washed it or something. If it got infected, he'd be truly screwed. He opened a fresh bottle of water, splashing some in his palm and then over the ragged tear. It felt like there was a hot coal stitched beneath his skin. He wiped his hands on his jeans, then tapped the keys gently, trying to decide what to do next. After a minute or two, he loaded up the Yahoo Answers page again, logging in with his ID. He chose the Ask option, typing in, "Why is everyone trying to kill me?" Then he filled in the next box. "This isn't a joke. My girlfriend just tried to kill me for no reason. Really tried. She bit my face. Then I went to fill up my motorbike at the garage and suddenly there was a crowd of people coming after me. Someone tried to run me over and they honestly would have killed me. They chased me up the road. I'm serious. This isn't a wind-up. I'm really scared. Has anyone else had the same thing happen? If you have, please answer." He read it through, making sure it didn't give anything away about his location. He couldn't do much about his identity. He had to use his Yahoo ID to post the question. But as long as nobody knew where he was, it would probably be okay. He selected the post option, waiting for the new page to load up. Looking over it again, the question looked absurd, so ridiculous that it made him doubt the whole thing. Had that really happened to him? Had he really been attacked? His face burned, his body shook, his stomach churned on itself again and again and again. Yes, it had happened. He closed the laptop to conserve the battery, folding his legs up to his chest and resting his head on his knees. All he could do now was wait. Daisy. Boxwood St Mary, 3:17 p.m. Daisy stared at the poster on the door of the school theatre, a lump in her throat the size of a house. It was the advert for the play, and where her name had once proudly stood was now a big black smudge. Underneath it somebody had scribbled Emily Horton as Juliet. For a moment Daisy decided she was just going to go home. After what had happened with Fred yesterday, this was too much. Mrs. Jackson and the rest of the drama club could throw themselves off a bridge for all she cared. It might be a mistake, but more likely it was a joke, somebody taking the mickey. If they wanted their precious Emily Horton, then they could have her. The stupid girl was supposed to be Daisy's understudy, and she hadn't even known what that meant. She'd skimmed through the entire play, looking for a character called Juliet's understudy before somebody had explained it to her. Yeah, She'd go home and forget about the whole thing. She'd be lying if she said she wasn't slightly relieved at the thought of not having to perform to a hall full of people. But that relief was poisoned by something else, something that sat inside her stomach like too much food. She tried to tell herself it was disappointment, and she was disappointed. There was no doubt about it. There were other things down there too, though. Anger, definitely. Hurt. And fear. There was a great deal of fear. Because she didn't really want to go home. She didn't want to have to explain to her parents that she'd been bumped from the lead role in the play. She didn't want to see them hide their disappointment. She didn't want them to order a Chinese as a treat because they thought it would make her feel better. It was more than that, though. She didn't want to walk in through the front door and find her parents still in bed. Daisy rubbed her temples, that same thump-thump drumming inside her skull. Then she walked into the theatre, a couple of lanky sixth formers nearly bowling her over on their way out. Hoisting her rucksack onto her shoulder, she made her way down the short corridor that led to the second set of doors. She pushed through them into a maelstrom of movement and noise, 100 or more kids running around the auditorium, leaping over the folding chairs, throwing balls of paper at each other. On the stage were a couple of girls from her class who'd been appointed scenery managers. They were trying to move a wooden picnic bench, Juliet's balcony, into the wings. Emily Horton was there too. She was on the other side of the boards, chatting with Kim and Fred, and she was wearing the Juliet dress. Her dress. Daisy hesitated. The theatre suddenly huge, the stage boundless. In her whole life she didn't think she'd ever felt so small. She walked up the steps towards the back of the stage, stepping through the curtain. In the sudden dark and dusty quiet, the tears began, too many of them to stop. She wrapped the heavy curtain around her, the same way she sometimes did with her duvet, pressing her face against it and sobbing gently. Why was everyone being so horrible? Was it just the stress of the play? Had she done something to upset them all? She waited until the moment had passed, then wiped her eyes, hoping they weren't too red. She didn't want to look like a silly crybaby. Then she inhaled deeply and marched across the stage until she was standing next to Emily. The girl was taller than her by about half a foot. So was Kim. Fred towered over them all, looking at Emily and smiling. Daisy didn't think she'd ever seen him smile like that before. "Excuse me," Daisy said. Nothing. She reached out, grabbing Emily's collar. Emily looked down. They all looked down, their smiles vanishing like mice beneath a hawk's shadow. Daisy's voice was a whisper. I'm playing Juliet." Emily's eyes seemed to swell, bulging. Then she turned away and carried on her conversation. Fred and Kim both laughed at something she said, but Daisy couldn't catch it. Her blood was hammering in her ears, like there was a giant machine between her temples. "There's been a mistake," she said, her eyes burning. "Don't cry, not again, be strong. You're the understudy, you're still the understudy." She glanced at Fred, hoping that maybe he'd say something, maybe he'd stick up for her. She knew he didn't fancy her or anything, but they'd spent 3 months pretending to be lovers. They'd had some awkward laughs about it. That had to count for something, right? Wrong. Fred was standing there, checking his nails, as if he couldn't bring himself to look at her. This was all his fault. Everybody had seen what had happened yesterday when he'd spat in her face, and now they all thought she was a total loser, not even worth talking to. Daisy turned back to Emily, a hot, fat tear worming down her cheek. "But you don't even know the lines," she said, brushing it away furiously. "You haven't been to rehearsals." Emily still didn't reply, grabbing the sleeves of her dress, too short, the ruffles only reaching the middle of her forearm, and tugging hard to try and make them longer. Daisy shook her head, tasting salt as the tears flowed freely again. That dress had been made for her. Her mum had taken in the sleeves especially, and she'd hemmed it too so that it fell right to her ankles and wouldn't trip her up. Emily was too big for it, packed in like a sausage in a casing. One sudden move and the dress would split. "You'll rip it," she tried, but the three of them were laughing again, Fred practically in stitches at something Emily had said. Why did he find her so funny? She was being really rude and really cruel. There was a call from behind the curtain, the whole thing billowing before Mrs. Jackson's face popped out. She saw the turmoil in the stands and trotted onto the stage, calling to the kids who rioted there. Right, everybody, this is no way to behave in a theatre. I want you all to take your seats. Straight away, please. Anyone who doesn't want to be here had better leave right now." Gradually, the noise levels ebbed as the audience took their seats, a few people drifting out the back. Mrs. Jackson looked at Emily. "Are you ready?" Emily nodded. "Good girl. Now off the stage so we can get started. You too, Fred, Kimberly." "Mrs. Jackson," said Daisy, "what about me?" Mrs. Jackson had already vanished back into the dressing room. Daisy stood there, hugging her backpack strap with both hands. Fred, Kim and Emily were strolling into the wings, still giggling. The audience were whispering in soft tones, occasional paper missiles still hurtling from row to row. Daisy had the terrifying idea that she was actually dead, that she'd choked in her sleep or something. How else could she explain what was going on? She felt like screaming out to the crowd just to prove that she existed. There was a crunch, and the lights in the hall went out. The stage spotlights blazing overhead, blasting away Daisy's shadow and making her feel even more like a phantom. Once again, the curtain opened. Mrs. Jackson reappearing. She walked to the centre of the stage, about 3 metres from where Daisy was standing, and held out her hands. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice trembling with nerves. "It's lovely to see so many of you here. As you all know, this is technically a dress rehearsal, not a finished report for performance, so please forgive any slips of the tongue or prompts from myself or occasional retakes." Daisy didn't move. Couldn't move, her cheeks burning more fiercely than the lights. "Please, please, please remember to turn off your mobile phones, children," Mrs. Jackson continued. "And yes, just enjoy the show. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Romeo and Juliet, a tragedy by William Shakespeare." Mrs. Jackson turned around to go, and Daisy managed to break her paralysis, waving her arms at the teacher. "Please, Mrs. Jackson," she whispered as softly as she could, sensing the weight of the audience in the shadows. "I need to talk to you." "You shouldn't be on the stage," Mrs. Jackson replied. The harsh lighting turned her face into a leather mask. "Get off!" "But you're going to ruin it!" Mrs. Jackson snapped, waving at Daisy like she was a fly on her dinner. "Now shoo!" Daisy stood there, in the middle of the stage, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. The crowd was silent, an audience of glass-eyed dolls. "Get off!" said Mrs. Jackson, and this time she took a step towards Daisy. The heat from the bulbs overhead was too much, an island of light in the middle of an ocean of darkness. Daisy stumbled, looking for the stairs. She saw them too late, missed her footing, and tumbled down. Pain grabbed her left leg like a clawed fist as she landed on her hands and knees, her heavy rucksack swinging over her shoulder. She waited for the laughter, the screams of delight, the insults, but the theatre was deathly quiet. Daisy struggled to her feet. From here, out of the glare, she could see the kids in the crowd. Nobody was looking at her. On stage, Mrs. Jackson was holding the curtain open, ushering out the girl who was playing the narrator. She gave her a thumbs up, then sank into the black depths. The girl took her position, then started to speak. 2 households, both alike in dignity." Daisy backed away, heading for the doors, wishing that everybody was laughing at her. This was worse. So much worse. This was like something from a nightmare. By the time she was at the doors, she was running, bursting through them, barreling out the main exit into the sun, her mind screaming, "This isn't happening, this isn't happening, this isn't happening," over and over again as she tore across the car park. Eventually she crashed against the hedge, snatching breaths in between fits of sobs. Only when she felt like she had wrung out every last tear did she look up, using her sleeve to clean her face. Compared with what had just happened, home seemed like the best possible thing she could imagine. Even if her parents were tucked up in bed, even if her mum, God forbid, was getting ill again, at least they still acknowledged she was there. Her mum was supposed to collect her again tonight at the usual time, but her house was only a 10-minute bus ride away. Daisy hurried up the path, swerving round the packs of pupils that loitered near the gates, wishing that one person, just one, a pupil or the teacher on duty or the policewoman who always stood outside at home time, would notice her. But she may as well have been invisible. There were 3 buses lined up on the road. She climbed on board the middle one just as it was leaving. She didn't have a bus pass, but after standing at the driver's side for a minute or so, waiting to pay, trying to stay upright as he accelerated down the road, she slinked off to a window seat at the front. From there she watched the world flash by, rubbing her throbbing temples, thinking that if she was a ghost, then surely she wouldn't have to keep wiping the glass to clear away her breath. The traffic was heavy, and it was more like 15 minutes before her street came into view. Daisy pressed the button. getting out of her seat when the bus pulled to a stop. It wasn't a long way to her house, but all the same she walked quietly, almost running, desperate to be inside, desperate to see her mum. If the tumour had come back, Daisy decided, then it didn't matter. She'd look after her. She'd make sure she was okay. Her mum had beaten it once before. She could do it again. She reached her front gate, feeling a little better. So what if everyone at her school was a total jerk? She had more important things to worry about. Maybe that's why she'd had such a rubbish week. Maybe life was preparing her for a tough few months. Maybe it was trying to make the thought of staying at home and caring for her mother easier. Yes, that was it. For the first time in what seemed like the whole day, she remembered to breathe in. She was halfway down the path before she realised that there was another piece of good news. Somewhere between getting off the bus and arriving at her front door, her headache had gone. And that is what happens usually almost exactly before everyone starts coming after you. So not good news really, Daisy. Sorry. We'll keep going. Brick. Thursville, 3:46 p.m. He saw her too late. The copse of plastic greenery shielding her approach. It was only when she screamed, a wet shriek gargled through a throat full of blood, that Brick knew she was there. Lisa threw herself at him, wedging him in the angle between the wall and the floor. Her body felt like a bag of bones and gristle, nothing in the right place, broken things poking through her skin. And yet she was heavy, too heavy, a dead weight that crushed him, which stopped him from getting up, even when her toothless maw stretched impossibly wide, closing over his mouth like a plunger, stealing the air from his lungs. "I still love you, Brick!" She breathed a hot stew of words into him, the stump of her tongue flicking against his lips. "Even though you did this to me! Even though you did this to me! Even though you did this to me!" Brick choked, crying out, swinging his fists. Lisa dissolved, spinning apart like sugar in water, leaving only the coppery taste of her. He lurched awake, gasping, heaving, his hands at his throat as if he could somehow widen his airways. He sucked in oxygen, his cries weakening as the nightmare bled away. He was drenched in sweat, his t-shirt plastered to his chest and back, his eyes stinging from the salt. The stuffed leopard stared at him, and he glared back. "Oh, great watchdog you turned out to be," he muttered, reaching over to the laptop and sliding it towards him. He opened it up, waiting for the dongle to connect to the internet. He'd left his Yahoo question page open, and he refreshed it, his heart kicking when he saw that somebody, PWNU13, had already left an answer. His excitement didn't last long. "Dear Weirdo, either you are a total nutjob who has imagined all this BS and needs professional help for your brain problems, or you are a total nutjob who has pissed off a lot of people and done some crazy stuff and needs to seek professional help for your psycho problems. Hope this helps." "Thanks a lot," he said to PWNU13, refreshing the page. Then again, just to make sure, before gently closing the laptop. What if it was just him? What if he was the only person in the world this was happening to? He remembered somebody at school once telling him that people could be allergic to each other, to the oils in their skin or something. Kissing or touching that person could bring them out in a rash, even send them into some kind of shock. Brick hadn't believed it at the time. The kid who told him this had also told him that rhino horns were made of hair. That's actually true. But it could have been true. What if people were suddenly allergic to him? To his one of those faces? Would that make them want to kill him? He considered going online again, Googling it, but he decided not to. Even if that's what was happening, looking at stuff on the internet wasn't going to help him. No, he'd wait it out. Sooner or later, somebody had to give him a sensible answer, didn't they? Brick rested his head against the wall, his heart still drumming from the dream. This time, he would stay awake. Well, this chapter's really sad. I remember this. Poor Daisy. Daisy. Boxwood St Mary, 3:48 p.m. It was like opening a door into another universe, cool darkness spilling out, muting the sunshine and the heat. The change in light was so extreme that it took Daisy's eyes almost a minute to penetrate the shadows of her hallway, the gloom inside her house like a solid, living thing. She stepped inside, pulling the Yale key free and wiping her feet on the big doormat. The silence was immense, as if it had wrapped itself around her head, pulling her in. In spite of the fact that her headache had gone, or maybe because of it, she felt weird, lighter somehow, as if part of her wasn't there. The house was empty. She could always tell. A house without people had a different sort of atmosphere, as though it was waiting for something. It creeped her out, and she'd told her parents plenty of times that she didn't like being here by herself. "Oh, you're almost a teenager now," her dad usually said. "Aren't you old enough to be alone in the house? Aren't you old enough now not to be spooked by shadows?" Yes, she was practically a teenager, but that didn't magically take away the fears that had lived inside you for all those years. A birthday didn't suddenly make you brave. Daisy slung her rucksack on the floor beneath the coat stands, massaging her shoulder where the strap had dug in. It was brighter in here now that the imprint of the sun had ebbed from her retinas, but even so she flicked the hall light on, and the kitchen light too, as she walked to the back of the house. Her dad would be at work. He was an accountant at a firm in Ipswich. Her mum hadn't gone back to teaching after her illness, but she'd often popped out for the shopping, or to see friends, or just to get a little fresh air. Or maybe they're at the hospital, Daisy's brain suggested. Needles plugged into her mum's veins, her hair coming out in handfuls, her face 1,000 years old. Dad pretending that his eyes are red raw because of the pollen or the exhaustion. She shushed the thoughts, going to the sink and filling a glass from the filter tap. Their back garden through the window was a mess. It always had been, even though both her mum and her dad were out there all the time in the spring and the summer. The little box of grass was short, but the flower beds were a riot of colour, taking over the garden like a tumour. A little more every day. Soon they wouldn't be able to get out the back door without being clawed to death by thorns and jaggies. She finished the water and walked back through the kitchen, heading for the living room. It would do her good to sit down and watch a little telly. It would help calm her. Already the events at school seemed like 1,000,000 years ago, vague and distant, as if she'd imagined them. It probably hadn't been as bad as it had seemed at the time. It wasn't as if this was the first time that people had ignored her. She was through the kitchen door when she realised that something was wrong. She ducked back inside, looking at the key box over the radiator. She'd made that box in her last summer in middle school. There was a door which wouldn't close because she'd screwed the hinges in the wrong place, and inside it were 9 hooks in rows of 3 for the family's keys. Hanging on those hooks were 3 sets, the spare one, her mum's and her dad's. Daisy frowned, prodding them as if to make sure they were actually there. The little best mum ever and dad's taxi and cash machine. Key fobs she'd bought them last Christmas jingled. That didn't make any sense. If the keys were still here, it meant they're still in the house. They're still upstairs. They're still in bed. Her skin went cold, goosebumps breaking out so fast that they stung. She nearly made a break for the front door, for the sun, before managing to calm herself down. It was no great shock that her parents were still in bed. She already knew, or as good as knew, that her mum was ill, so it made sense that she'd be up there under the covers resting, her dad keeping watch over her. So why didn't she want to go and look? Daisy stood by the kitchen door, unable to do anything else. Her fear was too huge to understand. It seemed to fill up her whole body. You're just worried about seeing her looking so sick again, she said to herself. And all that stuff at school today, it's just made you a nervous Nelly, that's all. But it wasn't just that. It was the thought of her dad smashing his head against the bed, looking at her with those manic, bug-eyed face of being cocooned forever in their 2 long arms. Daisy took a step forward, and another, her momentum building as she walked to the stairs. She was halfway up when she understood what had happened. It hit her like a fist to the gut, making her slump onto her hands and knees on the steps. It was the smell. She knew it from the time a cat had been hit and killed by a taxi outside their house. None of the neighbours had known who it belonged to, so her mum had brought it in and put it into a cardboard box in the garden shed. Daisy, she'd been 7 or 8, she couldn't remember, had snuck in first thing in the morning before her parents had woken up, hoping that it might have come back to life, that it would spring from the box and lick her hand and meow and purr, and that she could keep it and look after it and make sure nothing bad ever happened to it again. Daisy had opened that box, and the smell had clawed its way down her throat, right to her stomach. It wasn't a rotten smell, not like when the bin needed emptying. It was hardly even there at all, yet somehow it was everywhere. And even though she was only 7 or 8, Daisy had known exactly what that smell was. It was death, plain and simple. It was the smell that death left behind when it had been inside your house. It was here now. It clung to everything, the stairway carpet, the walls with the framed photographs on. It was on her skin too, so pungent that she thought at first that she was the one who stank, that death had come for her. Only it hadn't. It had been here, but it wasn't Daisy it had taken. She forced herself to climb the last few steps. Hunched over, she crossed the landing to her parents' room. The door was closed, and on it was a sheet of paper on which her mum's haphazard script read, "Daisy, do not open this door. Call the police, darling. Please don't come in." She reached up, a puppet, unable to stop herself. The handle popped, the door creaked, and a fresh wave of the smell washed over her, settling into her nostrils. The stench was so strong that there could have been 12 dead cats in boxes inside the room. 24, 100. Or one mum, her mind suggested, a perverse rhyme from somewhere inside her brain. One mum dead in the bed, the cancer is back and it messed with her head. "Shut up!" she shouted, the tears flowing. She leaned on the door jamb, trying not to breathe, but the sobs kept emptying her lungs, forcing her to suck the smell into her mouth. The heavy curtains were still pulled tight, and it seemed that there was no air in the dark room, just death. There were 2 figures in the bed, the same as before. Only this time they didn't stir. They sat propped against the headboard, leaning against each other, 2 shadows that reminded Daisy of the pictures she'd seen at school of the victims of the nuclear bombs in Japan, their shapes burned into the pavements by the heat of the explosion. She wanted to call out to them, but she didn't. She didn't want to fall into the silence where their responses should have been. Instead, she moved to the window, thinking that it was the lack of light which had her parents bound tight. Maybe if she let the sun in, the warmth, it would blast death away, clear his stench from the room. She grabbed hold of the heavy velvet, yanking the right-hand curtain first, almost hard enough to jar the pole loose from its mounts. The light that flushed in from outside was less golden than umber, burned and sticky. She wrestled with the left, jigging it along. It got stuck halfway and she had to tuck the end behind the mirror on the sideboard. She stared into the glass, seeing her parents asleep on the bed. They're asleep, that's all it is. It's obvious. Look closely and you'll see them breathing. Only they weren't asleep. They weren't even her parents. There was something wrong with their faces. Their muscles turned to jelly beneath their skin. A barrage of sobs broke free from her chest, and Daisy doubled over. She didn't fight them, she just let them come, knowing that whatever she saw when she turned around, it would be better if all the tears were already gone. She didn't know how much later it was that the last of them dropped from her trembling lips. With a heaving, groaning sigh, she walked to the bed and sat down on the edge of the mattress, the same place she had sat that very morning 1,000,000 billion years ago. She turned to face them. Her mum's head was resting on her dad's shoulder, and they looked more peaceful than she'd seen them in years. Their faces were pale, except for a spot of colour on each cheek. Their eyes were closed. They didn't look real. They looked like plastic models of her parents, like the waxwork people she'd seen once at Madame Tussauds. So close to human, and yet obviously not. But there was no denying the truth. These were her parents. Her mum and dad, the people who had created her and brought her up, who had seen her every single day of her life, who had nursed her when she was ill and fed her when she was hungry and hugged her when she was sad. And Daisy felt a scream building in her head, her mind reeling as if reality had slipped off the tracks and was now ploughing in a new and frightening direction. She no longer felt like crying. She wasn't entirely sure if she could remember how to. She looked at her mum's hand, cupped in her dad's, both of them as still as a photograph. Next to this was another sheet of paper folded in half, her name printed on the front. Daisy reached over and lifted it, opening it up. It was her mum's handwriting, scratched and scribbled in big, frightening, insane letters, and there was a lot of it. She scanned the lines, unable to make sense of it, as if it had been written in a foreign language. Only the final paragraph was clear. Paragraph was clear, inscribed in letters twice as big as the rest. Please forgive me, Daisy. Didn't you feel it? Something is coming, sweetheart, something bad, and it would have made us hurt you. I felt it already. Something inside me, something pleading with me to do terrible things to my little Daisy, to my sweet, beautiful daughter. I don't think it's the disease. No, it's definitely not the disease. I have taken care of your father for you. I don't know for sure if he would have hurt you, but I think so. We both would have. Be safe. Be strong. We love you, Daisy. We had no choice. We couldn't bring ourselves to hurt you. We couldn't do anything to hurt you. We would have hurt you. That last would was underlined so hard that the pen had been pushed through the paper. Daisy didn't read it again. She carefully folded it and laid it onto the bed. Her head was stuffed tight with cotton wool and packing chips, no thoughts allowed in or out. She stood, wanting nothing more than to get out of this room with its sickly orange light and its fat stench of death. She made her way calmly downstairs and back into the kitchen, pulling the cordless phone from its cradle and dialing 999. Somebody picked up on the third ring. "Emergency, which service do you require?" said a woman. An ambulance, please," said Daisy, like she was ordering a pizza. "My parents are dead. My mum killed herself. She's killed my dad too." There was a pause. Then the woman said, "Oh, my saints." It was, thought Daisy, a stupid thing to say. "You hold on now." There was a click. Then Daisy was talking to somebody else, a man. She answered his questions without really thinking, just staring out into the garden, not seeing the flowers or the grass or the sky, not seeing anything at all. "The ambulance will be with you real soon, okay?" the man said. "I'm going to stay on the line with you until it arrives. Just a couple of minutes, and we'll be there." Poor Daisy, that's horrible. Kind of half forgotten that, but that is a really morbid chapter. Can I imagine another chapter for a wee myself? Oh, yeah, I can. To be honest, you'd never even know, would you? I think I've said that before. I don't know why I had another drink of water and I'm bursting for a wee, but okay. So we haven't seen Cal this time, so we'll read Cal's chapter and then we'll probably stop. It won't be as long as we normally have, but then we'll stop. It just gets so violent, this book. Cal, Oakminster, 4:00 p.m. Cal sat in his living room, waiting for images of himself to appear on the television, waiting to see his own screaming face as he ran from the hunt. The house was empty, as it always was this time of day. His dad, a businessman who never liked to talk about what kind of business he did, was abroad, and his mum volunteered at the charity shop around the corner in the afternoons, Tuesday to Friday. He was glad that they weren't here. As much as he wanted to talk to them, to hear them say that everything would be okay, he didn't know what would happen when they saw him. They might come after you too, Cal. They might chase you and kick you and stamp you into the pavement just like everybody else wants to. And he needed to find out what was going on before they came home. He needed to work out what to do. His body shook. The last few hours didn't seem real. Couldn't be real. Those kinds of things didn't happen, except in the movies. And yet ugly purple flowers were blossoming on his arms, his chest, his neck and his back where they'd grabbed and beaten him. He had a bite mark on his hand which he couldn't even remember getting. He almost hadn't made it home. The car had seemed to pull people off the pavements like a magnet, random strangers throwing themselves at it, bouncing off like bags of meat, squirming in his rearview mirror. He'd expected to see the police behind him, had wanted to see the police there, just so that they could make sense of it all. But there were no police, no ambulances, just an army trying to batter its way inside the car. The crowds had dwindled the further from school he'd got, disappearing altogether when he'd reached his road 15 minutes later. He'd parked the gore-encrusted car inside the double garage so that nobody would see it, then staggered inside. He hadn't quite made it to the sofa, collapsing onto his knees beside the television where he still sat. The 24-hour Sky News channel had pretty much run its headlines, and there was nothing there about a savage mob attack on a 17-year-old boy in East London. He left the telly on, pushing himself up, forcing his numb legs to navigate across the living room to the computer desk by the French doors. He slumped into the chair, switching the machine on and closing his eyes while he waited for it to boot up. Images flashed against the dark canvas of his eyelids. Gaping mouths, blunt teeth snapping, fingernails stained with his blood, and 100 pairs of eyes all brimming with hatred, overflowing with it, straining right out of their sockets. They had meant to kill him. Without reason and without question. But why? What the hell had he done to provoke them? He opened up the Internet Explorer, loading the Yahoo homepage. He scanned the links down the left-hand side, not quite knowing what to do. He was clicking on the news page when his pocket started to vibrate, making him jump so hard that his knees cracked against the bottom of the desk. He pulled out his phone. It was Megan. He stared at her pixelated name laid over a photo of her with 2 pens in her mouth, pretending to be a vampire, for what felt like hours. Then he answered. Silence. His mouth felt too dry to form words. Cal, she said eventually, and he was relieved at how far away her voice sounded. Did you hear the news? That you all tried to kill me, he thought, but all that came out was a grunt. George is in hospital. She got trampled. Where did you go, Cal? We needed you. Cal lowered the phone, rubbing his eyes, then looking at her picture again to make sure the call was real. He heard Megan shouting his name, and he put it to his ear. Are you okay? She asked. Things got a little weird at school. They think there was a problem with the stands, that the kids at the back thought it was collapsing or something. We almost had our own Hillsborough. Megan, he managed eventually, what are you talking about? Today, during the match, she said. You must have seen it. We thought that's why you'd run off. Thanks very much for that, by the way, my hero. Did she not remember chasing him? Did she not see what had happened outside the English block, then on the street? Maybe in the confusion she hadn't realised what was happening. But she was there. You saw her in the pack, reaching for you through the fence, her face boiling. Maybe she just got carried away in the heat of the moment. Some kind of group hysteria or something. He'd heard about that sort of thing happening, loads of people fainting at the same time or going crazy. She was still talking, fast, the way she always did when she was emotional. You tried to kill me, he interrupted. Megan must have said 24 more words before it sank in. What? She said after a moment's pause. Be serious, Cal, this isn't a joke. George has got a broken leg and a fractured collarbone or something, and I've sprained my finger, which isn't much, but it still hurts, and it was scary, Cal, all those people. You think? He almost spat. Cal, please, will you meet us at the hospital? We're in the children's bit. Georgia didn't want to stay there, but they said she was too young for the adult wing. There's an Xbox. Please, Cal. There was no dishonesty in her voice, no sense that she was trying to lure him out so that she could attack again. There was just Megan, scared and hurt, but the same girl he'd known for nearly 11 years now, the same girl he'd once gone out with for 2 months when they were in year 5, who'd made him a little heart out of multicoloured paperclips that still sat on the windowsill in his bedroom. Even though he could see her running after him, teeth clenched, her face a mask of pure fury, he couldn't work out how to be angry with her. I'll be there, he said softly. It was a lie, but it seemed to calm her down. Just give me a little while, okay? And say hi to the others. I hope they can fix your finger. Megan laughed. Thanks, Cal. I love you. He didn't reply, and after a second or two she hung up. He sat there with the phone against his ear, unable to make sense of the conversation. Why didn't she remember? Had she blocked it out from shock or something? It didn't make any kind of sense. He thought about dialing Georgia to see whether she knew what had happened. Naz's number was floating around somewhere in his address book too, but what exactly could he say? Oh, hey Naz, just calling to ask why you tried to strangle me to death on the school field. It was crazy, and he threw the phone onto the desk with a grunt of frustration. Think, Cal, he said to himself, rocking back on his chair. What do you do? There were rules to surviving a natural disaster. He'd read about them. They were designed for earthquakes and volcanoes and hurricanes, stuff like that, but he guessed they'd work for this too. Rule 1, find a safe space. Well, he'd done that. He was safe here for the moment, anyway. Rule 2 was to check for injuries and do the utmost to ensure your own survival. Well, he was pretty beaten up, but he wasn't going to die from bruises and bites. Rule 3 was to look for other survivors, to make sure nobody was trapped under the rubble or cut off by lava or stuck on the roof of their house. Rule 3 essentially was to find out whether anyone else was in the same situation. Cal leant forward, clicking in the Yahoo search box. He paused for a moment, trying to work out the best way to phrase his question. Then he wrote, "Why is everyone trying to kill me?" We'll leave it there. Oh god, the next chapter is dark as well. Do you know, it's just horrible, isn't it? Writers are just horrible people. We just put characters through so much horrible stuff. I'm very, very sorry to all of them. I'm looking for my bookmark, but I've lost it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. We're about 10 minutes short today, but I really do need a wee. So I'll leave it there, and I'll hopefully be back tomorrow, and we'll find out what happens next. Yeah, cool. All right, well, have a lovely day, whatever you're doing. And, yeah, have fun. See ya. Bye.